Alright, Karina baby, today is the 14th, and the story for July 14th, you are 5 years, 3 months, and 4 days old today. Can you believe it? Mom, I can't believe it. This is stuck. I think it does get better when it's tired. So, things I can do is the story. Things I can do. I can stand on my head. I can touch my toes, belly button. Oh, I can touch my toes, button my shirt, and tie my bows. Help with the shopping, feed the birds, choose my own books, and read little words. Splash in my bath, climb the stairs, kneel at my bedside, and say my prayers. That is a lot of things that he can do. It's a little boy in the photo. You can do lots of things too. I know you can. You've been able to do lots of things since you were super little. Mama made sure of it. Mama made sure that you were really, really smart. I cared that you had enough to have a good foundation. So Mama started the Your Baby Can Read program with you from day one, and we did 2 storybooks every single day, no matter what. So we do storybook time in the morning, and then we do Your Baby Can Read, and then we do story time. Well, we did like 3 times a day. When you were a baby, when you were super little, we did lots and lots of story times and lots of stuff, because Mama just wanted to read to you and have that good foundation. So Mama would read you everything. It didn't matter what it was. I'd read you the cereal box, the oatmeal box, anything I was doing. I showed you what potatoes were. Look, potatoes, baby, potatoes. It didn't matter what it was. You know, I just wanted you to have opportunities to learn. And you did. And you did excellent. You did so good. You used to know what a rhombus was, and you used to know all kinds of things. Your favorite shape back then was an isosceles trapezoid. That's how amazing you are. I love you. You know that? I love you so much. Love the potential that you have. I love who you are. I love your heart. I love everything about you. I love you, baby. Alright, so this is Little Daylight. This is our next story in the princess book. And do we remember how to sign princess? It's like a sash and it goes down. Your name is Karina, and your name means princess. So that would be your sign if you wanted to sign it to somebody else. Mama did the K and did the happy sign because you fill my heart up with joy for Karina. So every time someone asked me what your name was in sign, I did that for it because that's what I chose for you. But your name literally means princess. Just a sash and down, princess, because you're my little princess and I love you. And then your middle name means flower. So it's like this, like you're smelling a bunch of flowers. I love you. I love you. I love you so much. Alright, so let's read this. Little Daylight. No house of any pretense is to be called a palace. It is the least worthy of the name, except it is moored near it, very near it, and the nearer the better. Not all round it, I don't mean that, for the palace ought to be open to the sun and the wind, and stand high and brave, with weathercocks glittering and flags flying, but on one side of each palace there must be a wood. And there was a very grand wood indeed, beside the palace of the king who was going to be Daylight's father. Such a grand wood that nobody yet had ever got to the other end of it. Near the house it was kept, very trim and nice, and it was free of bushwood for a long way in. But by degree it got wild, and it grew wilder and wilder and wilder, until some said wild beasts at last did what they liked in it. The king and his courtiers often hunted, however, and this kept the wild beasts far away from the palace. One glorious summer morning, when the wind and the sun were out together, when the vanes were flashing, and the flags flickering against the blue sky, little Daylight made her appearance from somewhere, nobody could tell where. A beautiful baby with such bright eyes that she might have come from the sun, only by the shone, she such lovely ways, and she might equally well have come out of the wind. There were great jubilations in the palace, for this was the first baby the queen has had, and there is such a happiness over a new baby in a palace as in a cottage. But there is a disadvantage of living near a wood. You do not know quite who your neighbors may be. Everybody knew where there were in several fairies living within a few miles of the palace, who always had something to do with each new baby that came, for fairies live so much longer than we, that they can have business with a good many generations of human mortals. The curtains houses they lived in were well known also. One a hollow oak, another a birch tree, though nobody could ever find how the fairies made a house in it. Another a hut of growing trees, intertwined and patched up with turf and moss. But there was another fairy who had lately come to the palace, and nobody even knew she was a fairy except the other fairies. A wicked old thing she was, always concealing her powers, and being as disagreeable as she could, in order to tempt people to give her offense, that she might have the pleasure of taking vengeance upon them. The people about thought she was a witch, and those who knew her by sight were careful to avoid offending her. She lived in a mud house in a swampy part of the forest. In all history we find that fairies give the remarkable gifts to princes and princesses, or any child of significant importance in their eyes. Also at the christening. Now this we can understand because it was an ancient custom among human beings as well, and it is not hard to explain why wicked fairies should choose the same time to do unkind things. But it is difficult to understand how they should be able to do them, for you would fancy all wicked creatures would be powerless on such an occasion. But I never knew of an interference on the part of a wicked fairy that did not turn out to be a good thing in the end. What a good thing, for instance, it was that one princess should sleep for 100 years, worthy of her. And did she not come awake exactly at the right time, help wishing a good many girls would sleep till just the same fate overturned them? It would be happier for them and more agreeable to their friends. Of course, all... Did you see what just happened there? The wicked fairy did something horrible, right? That they thought was horrible at the time. Princess, you must sleep for 100 years, right? But then the princess woke up and she had her knight in shining armor. She had her prince. And she had her happiness. And she had her puppies. She didn't have her mama and papa. But she had all of the people around her that she loved. I'm sure she missed her mama and papa like crazy, though. But it turned out to be a good thing in the end. Right? Mama's waiting for everything to be okay. I really am, baby. I know that your papa and I are just both what we are. And in the end of all of this, it's going to be a good thing. Mama and Papa are going to be okay. We're going to be better people for the character building experience. My father always used to say that it doesn't matter what you're going through. Everything you do is a character building experience. Don't let it break you. Don't become bitter. Stay sweet. Just stay sweet. Of course, all the known fairies were invited to the christening, but the king and queen never thought of inviting the old witch, for the power of the fairies have by nature, whereas a witch gets her power by wickedness. The other fairies, however, knowing the danger thus run, provided as well as they could against ancients from her quarters. But they could neither render her powerless, nor could they arrange their gifts in reference to hers beforehand. For they could not tell what those might be. Of course, the old hag was there without being asked. Not to be asked was just what she wanted, that she might have the sort of reason for doing what she wished to do. For, somehow, even the wickedest of creatures partakes for doing the wrong thing. 5 fairies have, one after the other, given the child such gifts as for continued best, and the 5th had just stepped back at her palace in a surrounding splendor of ladies and gentlemen, when, muttering and laughing between her toothless grin, the wicked fairy hobbled out into the middle of the circle, and at that moment when the archbishop was handing the baby to the lady, at the head of the nursery department of state affairs, addressed him, thus giving a bit or two to every word before she could part with it. Please, your grace, I'm very deaf. Would your grace mind repeating the princess's name? With pleasure, my good woman, said the archbishop, stooping to shout in the ear. The infant's name is Little Daylight. And Little Daylight it shall be, cried the fairy, in a tone of a dry axle. And little good shall any of her gifts do her, for I bestow upon her the gift of sleeping all day long, whether she will or not. Ha, ha, he, hi, hi. Then out started the 6th fairy, who of course the others had arranged should come out after the wicked one, in order to undo as much as she might. If she shall sleep all day, she said mournfully, she shall at least wake all night. A nice prospect for her mother and me, thought the poor king, for they loved her far too much to give her up to nurses, especially at night, as most kings and queens do, and are sorry for it afterwards. You speak before I had done, said the wicked fairy. That's against the law. It gives me another chance. I beg your pardon, said the other fairies all together. She did. I hadn't done laughing, said the crone. I had only got to hee, hi, hi, and I had to go through ho, ho, and hoo, hoo. So I disagree that if she wakes all night, she shall wax and wine with its mistress, the moon. Wax and wane with its mistress, the moon. And what that may mean, I hope till the royals will live to see ho, ho, and hoo, hoo. But out stepped another fairy, for they had been wise enough to keep two in reserve, because every fairy knew the trick of one, until, said the seventh fairy, a prince comes and shall kiss her without knowing it. The wicked fairy made a horrible noise, like an angry cat, and howled away and hobbled away. She could not pretend that she had not finished her speech this time, for she had laughed hoo hoo and ho ho. I don't know what that means, said the poor king to the seventh fairy. Don't be afraid, the meaning will come with the thing itself, she said. The assembly broke up, miserable enough. The queen at last prepared for a good many sleepless nights, and the lady at the head of the nursery departed, anything but comfortable in the prospect before her. For of course the queen could not do it all. As for the king, he made up his mind, with what courage he could summon, to meet the demands of the case. But wondered whether he could with any prosperity require a first lord of the treasury to take a share of the burden laid upon him. I will not attempt to describe what they had to go through for some time, but at least the household settled into a regular system, as it always does when you have a new baby. A very irregular one in some respects, for at certain seasons the palace rung all night with bursts of laughter and little daylights, whose hearts the old fairy cursed could not reach. She was daylight still, only a little in the wrong place, for she always dropped asleep the first hint of dawn in the east. But her merriment was short in duration. When the moon was at the full, she was in glorious spirits, and as beautiful as it is possible for a child of her age to be. But as the moon waned, she faded, until at last she was wan and withered, like the poorest, sickest child you might come upon in the streets of a great city in the arms of a homeless mother. Then the night was quiet as the day, for the little creature lay in her gorgeous cradle, night and day, with hardly a motion, and indeed, at last, without even a moan, like one dead. At first they often thought she was dead, but at last they got used to it, and only consulted the assemblage to find the moment when she would begin to revive, which of course was with the first appearance of the silver thread of the crescent moon. Then she would move her lips, and they would give her a little nourishment, and she would grow bigger and better. until, for a few days, she was splendidly well. When well, she was always merriest out in the moonlight, but even when near her worst, she seemed better when, in warm summer nights, they carried her cradle out into the light of the waning moon. Then in her sleep she would smile the faintest, most pitiful smile. For a long time very few people even saw her awake. As she grew older she became such a favorite, however, that the palace there were always some who were contrived to keep awake at night in order to be near her, but she soon began to take every chance of getting away from her nurses and enjoying her moonlight alone. And thus things went on until she was nearly 17 years of age. Her father and mother had by that time got so used to the odd state of things that they had ceased to wonder at them. All their arrangements had reinforced of the state of the princess's daylight, and it is amusing how things contrive to accommodate themselves. But how any prince was ever to find and deliver her appeared inconceivable. As she grew older, she had grown more and more beautiful, with the sunniest hair and the lightest and the loveliest eyes of heavenly blue, brilliant and profound as the sky of a June day, but so much more beautiful she was in the full moon, for more withered and worn did she become as the moon waned. At the time at which my story has now arrived, she looked when the moon was small and gone, like an old woman exhausted with suffering. This was the more painful that her appearance was unnatural, for her hair and her eyes did not change. Her wan face was both drawn and wrinkled, and had an eager, hungry look. Her skinny hands moved as if wishing but unable to lay hold of something. Her shoulders were bent forward, her chest went in, and she stopped as if she were 80 years old. At last she had to be put to bed, and there await the flow of the tide of life. But she grew to dislike being seen, still more being touched by any hands during this season. The lovely summer evening, when the moon lay all but gone upon the verge of the horizon, she vanished from her attendants, and it was only after searching for her a long time in great terror that they found her fast asleep in the forest at the foot of the silver birch and carried her home. A little way from the palace there was a great open glade covered with the greenest and softest grass. This was her favorite haunt. For her, the full moon, free and glorious, well, though a vista in the trees, she could gently set more or less of the daylight moon as it crossed the opening. Here she had a little rustic house built for her, and here she mostly resided. None of the court may go there without leave, and her own attendants had learned by this time not to be offensive in waiting upon her, so that she was very much at liberty. Whether the good fairies had anything to do with it or not, I cannot tell, but at last she got into the way of retreating further into the wood every night as the moon waned, so that sometimes they had great trouble in finding her. But as she was always very angry if she discovered they were watching her, they secretly dared to do so. At length one night they thought they had lost her altogether. It was morning before they found her. Feeble as she was wandering into the thicket a long way before the glade, and there she lay, fast asleep, of course. Although the fame of her beauty and sweetness has gone abroad, yet, as everybody knew, she was under a bad spell. No king in the neighborhood had any desire to have her for a daughter-in-law. There were serious objections to such a relation. About this time in the neighborhood kingdom, in consequence of the wickedness About this time in the neighboring kingdom, in consequence of the wickedness of the nobles, an instruction took place upon the death of the old king. The greater part of nobility was mastered, and the young prince was compelled to flee for his life, disguised like a peasant, for some time until he got out of the country. He suffered much from hunger and fatigue. But when he got into the rule of the princess's father, and had no longer any fear of being recognized, he fared better, for the people were kind. He did not abandon his disguise, however. One tolerable reason was that he had no other clothes to put on, and the other was that he had very little money, and did not know how to get any more. There was no good telling everybody he met that he was a prince, for he felt that the prince ought to be able to get on like other people, else his rank only meant a fool of him. He had read of princes setting out upon an adventure, and here he was out on a similar case, only without having had the chance in the matter. He would go on and see what would come of it. For a day or two he had been walking through the palace woods, and had next to nothing to eat, when he came upon the strangest little house inhabited by a very nice, tidy, motherly old woman. This was one of the good fairies. The moment she saw him, she knew quite well who he was, and what he was going to come of it, but she was not at liberty to interfere with the orderly march of events. She received him with the kindness she would have shown to any other traveler, and gave him bread and milk, which he thought the most delicious food he had ever tasted, wondering that they did not have it for dinner in the palace sometimes. The old woman pressed him to stay all night. When he awoke, he was amazed to find how well and strong he felt. She would not take any of the money he offered, but begged him, if he found occasion of continuing in the neighborhood, to return and occupy the same quarters. "Thank you much, good mother," answered the prince, "but there is little chance of that. The sooner I get out of the wood, the better." "I don't know that," said the fairy. "What do you mean?" asked the prince. "Why, how should I know?" replied she. "I can't tell," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. "How strangely you talk," said the prince. "Do I?" said the fairy. "Yes, you do," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. The prince was not used to being spoken to in the fashion, so he felt a little angry, and turned and walked away. But this did not offend the fairy. She stood at the door of her little house, looking after him, till the trees had hid him quite. Then she said, "At last," and went in. The prince wandered and got nowhere. The sun sank and sank way out of sight, and he seemed no nearer to the end of the wood than ever. He sat down on a fallen tree, ate a bit of bread that the old woman had given him, and waited for the moon, for although he was not much of an astrologer, he knew the moon would rise at some time, because she had risen the night before. Up she came, slow and slow, but a good size, pretty nearly round, indeed, whereupon, greatly refreshed with his piece of bread, he got up and went, he knew not whither. After walking a considerable distance, he thought he was coming to the outside of the forest, but when he reached it, what he thought was the last of it, he found himself only upon the edge of a great open space. In it, covered with grass, the moon shone very bright, and he thought he had never seen a more lovely spot. Still, it looked dreary, because of its loneliness, for he could not see the house on the other side. He sat down, weary again, and gazed into the glade. He had not seen so much room for several days. All at once he spied something in the middle of the grass. What could it be? It moved. It came nearer. Was it a human creature gliding across? A girl dressed in white gleaming in the moonshine. She came nearer and nearer. He crept behind a tree and watched, wondering. It must be some strange being of the wood, a nymph, whom the moonlight was the warm, dusty air had entraced from her tree. But when she came close to where he stood, he no longer doubted she was human, for he had caught sight of her sunny hair and her clear blue eyes, the loveliest face, and from that he had ever seen. All at once she began singing like a nightingale, and dancing on by the edge of the trees, and away in the great circle towards the one side, until he could see but a spot of white in the yellowish green of the moonlight grass. But when he feared it would vanish quite, the spot grew and became a figure once more. She approached him again, singing and dancing and waving her arms. The brook and broke out into a long, clear laugh, musical as a book. Then, if tired, she grew herself on the grass and lay gazing at the moon. The prince was almost afraid to breathe, lest he should startle her, and she should vanish from his sight. As to venturing near her, that never came into his head. She had lain for a long hour or longer, when the prince began again to doubt concerning her. Perhaps she would be a vision of his own fancy, or was she a spirit of the wood. After all, if she had two, would hunt the wood, glad to know the lost kingdom and everything for the hope of being near her. He would build him a hut in the forest, and there he would live for a pure chance of seeing her again. Upon nights like this, and last she would come out and bask in the moonlight and make her soul blessed. But while he thus dreamed, she sprang to her feet, turned her face full to the moon, and began singing as if she would draw her down from the sky by the power of the enchanting voice. She looked more beautiful than ever. Again she began dancing to her own music, and danced away into the distance. Once more she returned in a similar manner, but although he was watching as eagerly as before, what with fragile and with gazing, he fell asleep before she could come near him. When he awoke in the broad daylight and the princess was nowhere, he could not leave the place. What if she should come the next night? He would gladly endure a day's hunger to see her yet again. He would buckle his belt quite tight. He would round the glade to see if he could discover any prints of her feet. But the grass was so short, and her steps had been so light, that she had not left a single trace behind her. He walked halfway round the wood without seeing anything to account for her presence. Then he spied a lovely little house with thicket roof and low eaves surrounded by the encrusted garden, with doves and peacocks walking on it. Of course this must be where the gracious lady who loved the moonlight lived. Forgetting his appearance, he walked towards the door, determined to make inquiries. But as he passed a little pond full of gold and silver fishes, he caught sight of himself and turned to find the door in the kitchen. There he knocked and asked for a piece of bread. The good-natured cook brought him in and gave him an excellent breakfast, which the prince found nothing the worse for being served in the kitchen. While he ate, he talked with his enterers, and learned that this was the favorite retreat of the Princess Daylight. But he learned nothing more, both because he was afraid of seeming inquisitive, and because the cook did not choose to be heard talking about his mistress to a peasant lad who had begged for his breakfast. As he rose, he took his leave, and occasioned to him that he might not be far from the old woman's cottage, as he had thought, and he asked the cook whether she knew anything of such a place, describing it as well as he could. She said she knew it well enough, adding that with a smile, It's there you're going, is it? Yes, if it is not far off. It's not more than 3 miles. But mind you are about. But mind what you are about, you know. Why do you say that? If you're after any mischief, she'll make you repent it. The best thing that could happen under the circumstances, remarked the prince. What do you mean by that? Asked the cook. Why, it stands to reason, answered the prince. and that if you wish to do anything wrong, the best things for you is to mind to repent of it. I see, said the cook. Well, I think you may venture. She's a good old soul. Which way does it lie from here? Asked the prince. She gave him full instructions, and he left her with many thanks. Being not refreshed, however, the prince did not go back to the cottage that day. He remained in the forest, amusing himself as best he could by waiting anxiously for the night, in the hopes that the princess would again appear. Nor was he disappointed, for directly the moon rose, he spied a glimmering shape far across the glade. As if it drew nearer, he saw it was she indeed, not dressed in white as before, in a pale blue, like the sky. She looked lovelier still. He thought it was that the blue suited her yet better than the white. He did not know that she was really more beautiful because the moon was nearer to full. In fact, the next night was the full moon, and the princess was then be at the zenith of her loveliness. The prince feared for some time that she was not coming near, has hidden his hiding place that night, but the circle in the dance ever winded as the moon rose, until the last they embraced the whole glade, and she came still closer to the trees where he was hiding than she had come the night before. He was enchanted with her loveliness, for it was indeed a marvelous thing. All night long he watched her, but dared not go near her. He could have been ashamed of watching her too, had he not become almost incapable of thinking of anything but how beautiful she was. He watched the whole night long, and saw that the moon went down. She retreated in smaller and smaller circles until at last he could see her no more. Wearily as he was, he set out for the old woman's cottage. When he arrived just in time for her breakfast, which she shared with him, he then went to bed and slept for many hours. When he awoke, the sun was down, and despite the great anxiety lest he should lose a glimpse of the lovely vision, but whether it was by the mechanisms of a swept fairy, or merely that in one of the things to go to another to return to the same road he lost his way. I shall not attempt to describe his misery when the moon rose and he saw nothing but trees and trees and trees. She was high in the heavens before he reached the glade. Then indeed his troubles vanished, for there was the princess coming dancing towards him, in a dress that shone like gold, and with shoes that glimmered. There the grass like fireflies. She was of course still more beautiful than before, like an embodiment of sunbeams. She passed him and danced away into the distance. Before she returned to her circles in the clouds had begun to gather about the moon. The wind rose and the trees moaned, and their light branches leaned all one way before it. The prince feared that the princess would go in, and he should see her no more that night. But she came dancing once more in jubilation than ever. Her golden dress and her sunny hair seemed streamed upon the blast, her waving arms towards the moon, and in the exubrations of the daylight, ordering the clouds away from off her face. The prince could hardly believe she was not a creature of the elements after all. By the time that she complied to another circle, the clouds had gathered deep, and there was growling in the distance of thunder. Just as she passed the trees where he stood, a flash of lightning blinded him for a moment, and when he saw her again, to his horror, the princess lay on the ground. He darted to her, thinking that she had been struck. But when she heard him coming, she was on her feet in the moment. "What do you want?" she asked. "I beg your pardon. I thought the lightning," said the prince, hastening. "There's nothing the matter," said the princess, waving him off rather hauntedly. The poor prince turned and walked towards the woods. "Come back," said Daylight. "I like you. You do what you are told. Are you good?" "Not so good as I should like to be," said the prince. Then go and grow better," said the princess. Again disappointed, the prince turned and went. "Come back," said the princess. He obeyed and stood before her, waving. "Can you tell me what the sun is like?" she asked. "No," he answered. "But where's the good of asking what you know?" "But I do not know," she rejoined. "Why, everybody knows." "That's the very thing. I'm not everybody. I've never seen the sun." "Then you can't know what it's like till you do see it." "I think you must be a prince," said the princess. "Do I look like one?" said the prince. "I can't quite say that." "Then why do you think so?" "But you both do what you are told and speak the truth." The sun is very bright as the lightning. But it doesn't go out like that, does it?" "Oh, no, it shines like the moon rises and sets like the moon. It's much the same shape as the moon, only so bright that you can't look at it for a moment." "But I would look at it," said the princess. "But you can't," said the prince. "But I could," said the princess. "Why don't you then?" "Because I can't." "Why can't you?" "Because I can't wake. And never shall I wake until—" Here she hid her face in her hands, turned away, and walked into the slowest, stillest manner towards the house. The prince ventured to follow her at a little distance, but she turned and made a repellent gesture, which, like a true gentleman prince, he obeyed. At once he waited a long time, but as she did not come near him again, and as the night had grown now clearer, he set off for last for the old woman's cottage. It was long past midnight when he reached it, but to his surprise the old woman was paring potatoes at the door. Fairies are found to be doing off things indeed. However they may be disagreeable, the night is always their day, and so it was with all who had fairy blood in them. "Why, what are you doing there, this time of night, mother?" said the prince, for that was the kind of way in which a young man in his country would address a woman who was much older than himself. "Getting your supper ready, my son," she answered. "Oh, I don't want any supper," said the prince. "Ah, you've seen daylight," she said. "I've seen a princess who never saw it," said the prince. "Do you like her?" asked the fairy. "Oh, don't I?" said the prince. "More than you would believe, mother. A fairy can believe anything that ever was, ever could be, said the old woman. Then you are a fairy? Asked the prince. Yes, she said. Then what do you do for things you do not believe? Asked the prince. There's plenty of them. Everything that never was, nor ever could be. Plenty, I grant you, said the prince. But do you believe there could be a princess who never saw the daylight? Do you believe that now? This, the prince said, nor he doubted the princess, but that he wanted the fairy to tell him more. She was too old a fairy, however, to be caught so easily. Of all people, fairies must not tell secrets. Besides, she is a princess. Well, I'll tell you a secret. I'm a prince. I know that. How do you know that? By the curl of the third eye on your left eyelid. By the curl of your third eyelash on your left eyelid. Which corner do you come from? That's a secret. Another secret? Well, at last. I'm a prince. There can be no harm in telling me about a princess. It's just the prince I can't tell. There aren't any more of them, are there? Said the prince. What? You don't think you're the only prince in the world, do you? Oh, dear, no, not at all. But I know there's one too many just at present, except the princess. Yes, yes, that's it, said the fairy. What's it? Asked the prince. But he could get nothing more out of the fairy, and he were to go to bed unanswered, which was something of a trial. Now the wicked fairy will not be bound by the law which the good fairies obey, and this always seems to give the advantage over the good, and the bad the advantage over the good. For they use means to gain their ends, which the others will not. But it is all of no consequence, for what they do never succeeds. Nay, in the end it brings about a very thing that they are trying to prevent. So you see that somehow, for all their cleverness, wicked fairies are dreadfully not very smart. For although, I didn't realize this book was so long. Okay. Nay, in the end, brings about the very thing they were trying to prevent. So you can see that somehow, for all their cleverness, wicked fairies are dreadfully not very smart. For although from the beginning of the world they have really helped instead of thwarting the good fairies, not one of them, in a bit wiser for it. She will try the bad thing just as they all did before her, and succeed no better, of course. The prince had so far stolen a march upon the swampy fairies that she did not know he was in the neighborhood until after he had seen the princess thus 3 times. When she knew it, she consoled herself by thinking that the prince must be far too proud and too modest for any young man to venture even to speak to her before he had seen her 6 times at least. But there was even less danger than the wicked fairy thought, for however much the princess must desire to be set free, she was dreadfully afraid of the wrong prince. Now, however, the fairy was going to do all she could. She so contrived for the dreadful spells that not the next night the prince could not by any devourer to find his way to the glade. It would take me too long to tell her tricks. They would be amused to this, who knew that they could not do any harm. But they were something other than amusing to the poor prince. He withered about in the forest till daylight, and then fell asleep. The same thing occurred for 7 following days, during which neither could find the good fairy's cottage. After the 3rd quarter of the moon, however, the bad fairy thought she might be able to ease about the affair of the fortnight at last, for there was no chance of the prince wishing to kiss the princess during that period. So, the 1st day of the 4th quarter, he did find the cottage, and the next day he found the glade. For nearly another week he hunted it, but the princess never came. I have little doubt she was on the further edge of some part of every night, but at this period she always wore black, and there being little or not light, the prince never saw her, nor would he have known her if he did see her. How could he have taken the wrong, decrepit creature she was now, for the glorious Princess Daylight? At last, one night, when there was no moon at all, he ventured near the house, where he heard voices talking, although it was past midnight, for her women were in considerable uneasiness, because the one whose turn into what to it was watch her had fallen asleep, and had not seen which way she went. And this was the night which she was probably wander very far, describing the circles in which did not touch the open glade at all, but stretched away from the black into the house, deep into the side of the forest, a part of which the prince knew nothing. When he understood from what they said that she had disappeared, and that she must have gone somewhere in said direction, he plunged at once into the wood to see if he could find her. For hours he roamed with nothing to guide him but the vague notion of the circle in which one side bothered on the house, for so much he had picked up from the talk he had overheard. It was getting towards the dawn, but as yet there was no streak of light in the sky, when he came to a great birch tree and sat down. Weary at the foot of it, while he sat very miserable, you may be sure, full of fear for the princess, and wondering how at her attendants could take it so quietly, and betaking himself that it would not be a bad plan to light a fire, which if she were anywhere near would attract her. This he managed with a tinder box which the good fairy had given to him. It was just beginning to blaze up when he heard a moan, which seemed to come from the other side of the tree. He sprang to his feet, but his heart throttled so that he had not leaned for the moment against the tree before he could move. When he got round and lay, a human form, in a dark heap on the earth, there was light enough for his fire to show that it was not the princess. He lifted in his arms a hardly heavier than a child, and carried it to the flame. The countenance was that of an old woman, but it had a fearfully strange look. A black hood concealed her hair, and her eyes were closed. He laid her down as comfortably as he could, chafed her hands, put a little cordial form of a bottle, also a gift of the fairy, into her mouth, took off her coat and wrapped it about her. Oh, took off his coat and wrapped it about her. In a short, did the best he could. In a little while she opened her eyes and looked at him, so pitifully. The tears rose and flowed from her gray, wrinkled cheeks. But she said never a word. She closed her eyes again, but the tears kept on flowing. For her whole countenance she was utterly pitiful, that the prince was near crying too. He begged her to tell him what was the matter, promising to do all he could to help her. But still she did not speak. He thought she was dying, and took her into his arms again to carry her to the princess's house, where he thought the good-natured cook might be able to do something for her. When he lifted her, the tears flowed yet faster, and he gave such a sad moan that it went to his very heart. "Mother, mother," he said, "poor mother." He kissed on her, on the withered lips. She started, and what eyes they were when they opened upon him. But he did not see them, for it was still very dark, and he had enough to do to make his way through the trees towards the house. Just as he approached the door, feeling more tired than he could ever have imagined possible, she was such a little thin old thing. She began to move and became so restless that, unable to carry her at the moment longer, he thought to lay her in the grass, but she stood upright on her feet. Her hood had dropped, and her hair fell about her. The first gleam of the morning was caught on her face. That face was bright and never-aging dawn, and her eyes were lovely as the sky of the darkest blue. The prince recoiled in overmastering wonder. It was Daylight herself, whom he had brought from the forest. He fell to her feet, not dared to look up until laid her hand upon his head. He rose then. "You kissed me when I was the old woman. There, I kiss you when I am a young princess," muttered Daylight. "Is that the sun coming?" Oh, how sweet. So Daylight was captured in a spell where she had to stay an old woman during certain periods of the moon, right? And the prince kissed her, trying to save her, because he didn't know what else to do. So the spell was broken. So that's little Daylight. Alright, Karina baby, let's do a song. And then Mama has to go and milk the cow. Alright. Let's do, because it's morning time, let's do Boker Toe, good morning. We sing Boker Toe, we thank you for this life. We sing Boker Toe each morning. This way we know it will be alright. Eventually, baby, everything's gonna be okay. You just have to believe in God and know that God's gonna guide you. I know Mama might be a little superstitious about stuff like that, but I do believe that in the end, everything is a good character building lesson. We get to grow more and more loving with every trial and tribulation that God lets us go through and guides us through, okay? Don't become bitter over situations and circumstances. Learn to love people more. And learn that when people hurt you, it's just because they're hurting themselves. Like, their hearts, like Papa is hurt over a lot of things. And just like the story that we read the other day from Aesop's Tale of Fables, sometimes the wheels who just have to turn and they're not suffering that much are complaining more than the people who, or the animals who are suffering so much that they are like, just be grateful for every breath that you take, every ounce of love that you get, every enjoyment that you have in life. You have to be grateful. Karina, baby, Mama loves you. Mama will always love you. And just like Papa used to always say, Papa's my moon, I'm his sun, and you are quite literally our rainbow baby, and we love you. No matter what, we both love you, baby. I love you. Have a beautiful day.